Richard. I think there's a slight obsession with the simple to complex. If you're building a factory, say for manufacturing computers, they'll dig a hole in the ground first. That's very simple, and it gets more complex as it goes up. But everything comes from the mind of the planners. And what I'm talking about is inference to the best explanation. And the inference, when we look at the semiotics, say, of DNA and the fact that it carries a biological message, so to speak, to an intelligent designer, seems to me to be much more sensible than the inference to mindless processes that we do not know can do any such thing. But that's a big debate, and we've both written about it, and you'll have to be referred to the literature, because I want to come to this topic about Christianity being dangerous, and I want to agree very largely with a lot of what you say, the danger of fanatical religion that fans the flames of violence. And quite frankly, I'm ashamed as a Christian of the reputation, particularly in the Middle Ages, the Crusades and so on, that they're associated with Christianity. But I'd like to point out that the perpetrators of that kind of atrocity were not following Christ, but they were actually disobeying his explicit command, because he prohibited, very famously, as you know, his followers from using physical weapons. My kingdom is not of this world, he told them. He told Pilate. And it's very interesting, to my mind, that Christ was actually put on trial for being a fanatical terrorist. That's very easy to forget, and he was publicly exonerated from the charge by the Roman procurator. Truth cannot be imposed by violence, particularly the truth that Christ had come into the world to bring a message of God's love and forgiveness. So I would agree with you, and the danger of training children to be fanatics by not allowing them to question is a very serious one. And I'm so glad that I had parents who encouraged me to think, and part and parcel of the Christian faith was that thinking. Now, you ask us to imagine with John Lennon a world without religion. Well, I'd like you to imagine with John Lennox a world without atheism, with no Stalin, with no Mao, with no Pol Pot, to name the heads of the three officially atheistic states. A world with no gulag, no cultural revolution, no killing fields. I think that would be a world worth imagining too. And I must say, I am very disturbed in your book by what seems to me to be an attempt to airbrush out the atrocities of the communist world. I've spent a lot of time visiting that part of the world, and I don't recognize anything that you say. Atheism was not peripheral to Marxism. For Marx, the criticism of religion was the foundation of all criticism. And so, it concerns me that a scientist who's very interested in historical science in the sense of evolutionary biology unraveling history is content with a very superficial analysis of the period of the Cold War. And even more disturbed to read things like this. Even if we accept that Hitler and Stalin shared atheism, they both also had moustaches, as do Saddam Hussein. So what? Well, yes, all three of them had noses in common with the rest of us. But what kind of reasoning is this? We're not talking about shared characteristics in general, but the motivating ideology that drove these men to murder millions in their attempt to get rid of religion, whether Jewish, Christian, or anything else. So I'm very disturbed at your historical analysis. You write that you don't believe there's an atheist in the world who would bulldoze Mecca or Chartres or York Minster or the Cathedral of Notre Dame. But what about the thousands of churches that were demolished in Stalin's Russia and the forced transformation of them into museums? Now, I can understand why one would want to rewrite the history of the 20th century to airbrush out the role of atheism, because one could very easily draw a parallel between the anti-religious agenda of the new atheists and the attempt of communism to obliterate religion. That's not going the right way, I think. And I'm sure that you would be rightly insulted, and I wouldn't suggest it for a moment, If I were to say that because you and Stalin were atheists, that you would have approved of the ruthless elimination of millions, you rightly expect me to differentiate between atheists. I would like you to write another book in which you differentiate between religions, because they are not all the same. Some support fanaticism, others don't. And then finally, you contend that the teachings of moderate religion are an open invitation to extremism. Well, that is not true of the teachings of Christ. I can't speak for other religions. But what about the moderate teaching of atheism? I've sat beside a young girl of 13 in the GDR who's just been told as the brightest child in the school that she cannot have any more education since she's not prepared to swear public allegiance to the atheistic state. I would call that intellectual murder, and it was committed many times in the name of atheism. But according to you, it's far worse than bulldozing buildings, but you say there's not the smallest evidence that atheists do such things. But there is. But perhaps I've misunderstood you.
You did.
You want to take a moment?
Well, I'm very happy to give up on the next one and
Which would you prefer?
I'm very happy. I'd like
right,
Richard
let's
to
go.
choose what he wants to do, because I've made some strong statements.
Look,